Think about a massive skyscraper being built right in the middle of a really bustling city. What do you actually observe when you walk past it?
Well, you see the physical stuff, right? The cranes, the dirt.
Exactly. You notice those towering cranes pivoting in the sky. You see massive steel I-beams being hoisted up, hundreds of feet.
Yeah, and you definitely hear it.
Oh, it's deafening. The jackhammers, the welding torches. It is this deeply physical, incredibly loud experience. You can walk right up and touch the concrete barricades.
Right. It's totally tangible.
But what remains entirely invisible to, the person walking down the street looking up at that site is the underlying architecture of intent. The unseen forces that dictated that building was going to exist in the first place.
Which is really the actual foundation of the building.
Precisely. You don't see the decades-old zoning laws that privilege that specific city block, right? You don't see the opaque financial derivatives and the massive international capital flows that are actually funding the concrete.
No, absolutely not. And you certainly never witness those quiet, insulated boardroom meetings.
Right. Where the real power sits, sketching out the shape of the skyline years before a single shovel even touches the dirt.
It's fascinating because we're universally mesmerized by the concrete.
Yeah.
We obsess over the physical manifestation of power, but we remain completely blind to the intent and those invisible systems that actually construct our reality. We ignore the architecture that holds it up, funds it, and, crucially, dictates who is allowed inside.
And that dynamic, that friction between the visible struggle and the invisible architecture, that is exactly the core of what we are deep diving into today.
It's a huge topic.
It really is. We're taking you into a profound exploration of a deeply provocative set of source materials. We're examining the nature of power, the brutal realities of land ownership, and most importantly, uncovering the invisible forces that the authors of these texts claim are actively manipulating the global economy.
And for those of you who have been navigating this massive stack of source material alongside us in our previous deep dives, you already have the foundational context for this.
Right, from the first 6 parts.
Exactly. We spent a lot of time meticulously unpacking the staggering reality of structural poverty currently paralyzing much of southern Africa.
Yeah, we looked at that terrifying demographic mathematics.
The ticking time bomb, basically. Nearly 68.6 million young people who are rapidly entering a stagnant, hostile, and just utterly unprepared labor market.
Which is just a staggering number to try and comprehend. And we also spent time exploring the highly specific philosophy presented by what the texts refer to as the 30K Club.
Right, which was a really fascinating discussion.
It was, because it introduced this intense differentiation in economic models. The authors draw a really hard line between what they call destructive killing orders.
The extraction-based system.
Exactly. Economic systems operating entirely on short-term greed and the systemic suppression of local populations. And they contrast that with their own proposed mandate, which they call sacred enterprise.
Which, according to the text, demands absolute self-accountability. It's about rejecting victimhood and actively building an entirely new economic civilization.
Right. So we laid out the mechanics of that argument previously, but the mission for today's deep dive, we are crossing a major threshold. We are bridging the deeply physical world with something far more esoteric and, frankly, structural.
We really are. But first, we need to ground ourselves by briefly reviewing the brutal physical mathematics of land ownership in southern Africa, which the authors lay out in what we call the Pod 7 material.
Yes, the physical board game.
Right. But from there, we are plunging entirely into the later chapters, the Pod 8 texts. These deal with the profound and quite jarring revelations about what the authors call the spiritual anchor of the soil.
And I gotta warn you, the later portion of this material is a heavy hitter. The authors move totally away from standard economic theory here.
They really do. They reframe it completely.
They start exploring modern economics not as this neutral system of global trade, but as a highly engineered form of silent, invisible oppression.
It's a dark premise.
It is. So the ultimate question we want you to hold in your mind as we navigate this today is deeply personal. Are you an active architect of your own economic reality? Or have you been convinced by a deeply flawed system that waiting around for things to improve is a neutral act?
Because answering that requires a fairly ruthless level of honesty.
Totally.
But before we can even begin to understand the complex concepts of spiritual warfare in economics from the later texts, we absolutely have to understand the physical board game being played.
We have to look at the dirt itself.
Exactly. We have to look at the dirt.
Let's start right there. To comprehend why millions of people are trapped in generational poverty, despite living in a region overflowing with a massive mineral wealth and agricultural potential, the authors argue we must examine the literal foundation, the land.
And the source material uses this remarkably accessible analogy here.
The giant pizza analogy.
Yes, it asks the reader to imagine a nation's entire landmass as a giant pizza.
A giant, highly contested, and historically very violently divided pizza.
Well, yeah, precisely. And the text poses a really simple but brutal set of questions regarding this pizza.
Mm-hmm.
Who gets the biggest, most nutrient-dense slices?
Right.
Who is left fighting in the dirt over the crusts? And ultimately, who owns the cardboard box the pizza actually came in?
I love that framing. And to answer this, the source breaks down land distribution in southern Africa into three distinct legal categories.
Which is absolutely crucial to understand the whole economic trap they describe later.
So let's break it down. The authors strip away the complex legal jargon. The first slice of the pizza is allocated to the general public.
Also known as communal land or customary land.
Exactly. And what is vital to internalize here is just the sheer scale. We're talking about millions upon millions of everyday citizens living, being born, and dying on this land.
But they don't possess a formal, legally recognized title deed.
Right. I want to pause and make sure we really define the gravity of that. They do not have that crucial piece of legal paper from a centralized government.
The paper that says, this specific plot is mine, I own it privately, and the state protects my right to it.
Exactly. Instead of a title deed, they possess traditional use rights. These are often overseen by local chiefs or traditional leaders based on historical community agreements.
So they can build homes there.
Yeah, they're permitted to build a farm for basic survival, and they can pass that use right down to their kids. But because they lack a legally recognized commercial title deed, they are effectively locked out of the formal global capitalist banking system.
They are living on the earth, farming it, but in the eyes of a commercial bank, they're essentially economic ghosts.
Economic ghosts. That is exactly it. Imagine farming a piece of land for 40 years. You know the soil, you have a family, you produce a small yield. But then you want to scale up.
You want to buy a commercial tractor.
Right, or install a modern irrigation pivot so you can actually enter the commercial market. So you walk into a centralized bank in the capital city and you ask for a business loan.
What's the very first thing the loan officer asks for?
Collateral. They ask for the title deed to the land to secure the massive debt. And you hand them a letter from a local chief detailing a verbal agreement.
And the bank immediately rejects the application.
Instantly. Without that legal paper, the land simply cannot be monetized in the current global system.
And that is the exact friction point the text highlights. You have massive populations sitting on potential wealth, but structurally paralyzed by a lack of access to capital markets.
Which brings us to the second category of land ownership, the government, or state land.
The slice owned directly by the nation's political apparatus.
Right. We're talking massive national parks, expansive military testing bases, government building complexes, and, large nature reserves for tourism.
Which is a huge chunk. But then we get to the third category.
The third slice of the pizza. And according to the authors, this is where the entire game of global wealth is actually decided.
Category 3, big corporations and elites.
Legally, this is private, freehold, or concession land. This is territory owned privately with ironclad, internationally recognized title deeds, or it's sovereign territory leased directly to multinational companies by the government itself.
And the source makes it abundantly clear this specific category is strictly, exclusively utilized to generate massive amounts of international capital.
It's the realm of intense commercial farming conglomerates.
Colossal international mining operations.
And luxury, high-yield real estate developments. To really bring this out of the abstract, let's look at the specific country data the authors provide, because the stats are grim.
Yeah, they paint a really stark picture. Take
Yeah.
Zambia, for example. The text points out that an overwhelming 94% of the nation's land is classified as customary land.
94%.
Right, that's the vast majority of the geography, where the everyday population does survival-level agriculture. But the remaining 6%, the land owned by corporations through statutory leaseholds, holds the massive world-class copper mines.
And those mines drive almost the entirety of the nation's GDP and global wealth.
Exactly. It's a perfect illustration of the structural monopoly dynamic. The overwhelming majority of the human population occupies the vast majority of the physical land, yet a microscopic elite holds the tiny fraction that actually generates global capital.
And it's the exact same pattern in
Oh,
Eswatini.
yeah.
The text shows that 75% of the land there is Swazi nation land, held in trust for the public, but the people are largely reliant on unpredictable, basic rainfall for survival farming,
While the remaining 25% is title deed land.
which is heavily capitalized, highly irrigated, and produces super lucrative cash crops like sugar and timber specifically for international export.
The narrative takes an even sharper turn when the authors analyze Mozambique and Angola.
Right, because their legal framework is completely different.
Totally. In those nations, the state legally owns 100% of the land.
The citizens literally own 0% in terms of private commercial deeds.
Right, they only possess those use rights we discussed. So the state has total monopoly control.
But what does the state actually do with that absolute ownership? Because according to the text, the government routinely bypasses its own impoverished citizens.
Yeah, they lease millions of hectares directly to foreign cartels for oil extraction, diamond mining, and large-scale commercial forestry.
And when you hear that data, when you hear that the state holds 100% of the land or massive swaths of it while the population starves immediate, logical response is to look to politics for a cure.
Especially for observers raised in Western democratic traditions.
Exactly. I know that was my first thought. If the government owns the land or holds the legislative power, why don't the people just elect leaders who will fix it?
Mobilize the voting bloc, right.
Right. Vote in a populist government, mandate that the state land be carved up and handed out to the impoverished citizens, and solve the crisis overnight.
It is the most intuitive question to ask. But the authors argue forcefully that relying on the political apparatus to solve a structural economic monopoly is a fatal miscalculation.
The text points to what they call stomach politics.
Yeah, campaigning on promises of basic, immediate survival. Handing out food parcels, promising temporary grants just weeks before an election.
Managing the symptoms of poverty, not curing the disease.
Mm-hmm.
And I really want to break down the mechanics of why the political solution fails, because the source provides a three-pronged argument here that really challenges mainstream development theory.
The first failure point is the physical nature of state land itself. There's this assumption that if the government owns land, it must be lush and ready for farming.
Which is rarely true.
Right. In reality, the land the government holds in reserve is often harsh desert, rocky terrain, or protected wildlife parks meant for tourism revenue.
You can't just hand a family a title deed to an arid desert with no water access and command them to build a thriving agricultural empire.
The physical reality of the dirt prevents simple redistribution from working.
And the second failure point is even more critical. It revolves around the sheer lack of capital.
Let's create a hypothetical.
Okay, let's say a politician miraculously manages to hand over prime, fertile state land to impoverished citizens. The government itself, already burdened by national debt, rarely possesses the massive financial capital required to make that land profitable.
The state does not have the billions of dollars needed for advanced tractors, deep well irrigation systems, high-yield seeds, and fertilizers.
All the things necessary to compete in the global market. So the people get the dirt, but without the capital infrastructure, they remain utterly paralyzed economically.
They own a farm they literally cannot afford to run.
And the third reason the authors cite is perhaps the most cynical: systemic political betrayal.
Like in Mozambique and Angola. Even with total control, the political elite betray the public interest by leasing the most valuable land straight back to the massive monopolies.
Why? Because those international cartels are the only entities operating within the borders that possess the massive upfront capital, machinery, and global supply chains to actually extract the resources.
They're the only ones who can generate the tax revenue the state relies on to survive. So the state becomes dependent on the very monopolies it's supposed to be regulating.
Exactly. And the text also completely dismantles a very famous economic policy that's been pushed for decades: the willing buyer, willing seller policy.
Oh, this is a fascinating part of the text. On paper, it sounds incredibly rational.
Right. The idea is the government acts as a patient buyer on the free market. They wait for a massive corporate farm to decide to sell, buy it at a fair price using tax funds, and redistribute it to the poor.
A peaceful, market-friendly solution.
But the authors declare this a massive, undeniable failure in practice. Because if you are a multinational monopoly making billions off the most fertile land, why would you ever willingly choose to sell it?
You wouldn't. You have no desire to liquidate a perpetual profit machine.
And furthermore, the text notes that when these entities do decide to sell, they demand such astronomical premium prices that the government literally cannot afford to buy the country back piece by piece.
So we arrive at a deeply frustrating impasse. The political system is essentially impotent against international capital, and the monopolies refuse to relinquish their grip on the profit-generating slices of the pizza.
Which naturally leads the desperate populations to a very aggressive thought process. If politicians can't vote it back and the Treasury can't buy it back, then the visceral human reaction is, we have to fight for it.
Okay.
We have to violently seize it.
And this historical impulse to wage a national economic war for the physical dirt is the focus of the next major argument.
Article 34.
Right. The authors argue that giving in to this impulse is actually a devastating, highly engineered trap.
It's an illusion of liberation that deepens enslavement. And the way they synthesize this completely reframed how I view historical land reforms. Let's walk through their hypotheticals.
Imagine you're part of a marginalized community. You rebel against the state, you fight a grueling conflict, and you forcefully win 100 acres of prime land from a corporate monopoly today.
You tear down their fences, plant your flag, and celebrate a massive victory.
It would be viewed globally as this monumental underdog victory.
But the text forces us to look at the very next day. You wake up on your 100 acres, your community is still starving, you have absolutely no money in the bank.
You don't have the millions needed for commercial tractors or heavy-duty irrigation.
Or the patented seeds and chemical fertilizers required to yield a profit on a global scale. You have the dirt, but zero means of production.
So, faced with that reality, what is your only available move?
Your absolutely only option for survival is to walk into a commercial bank.
You have to go to the exact same centralized banking monopolies that funded the corporations you just fought a war against.
Right. And you have to beg them for a business loan, handing them the title deed to the land you just bled for as collateral.
And this is the crux of the illusion. The text states clearly, by doing this, you do not become a sovereign landowner. You simply become a dependent, highly stressed sharecropper.
Working your own newly acquired soil just to pay off the central monopoly's exorbitant interest rates. You haven't escaped the oppressive structure. You've negotiated a more stressful set of chains.
The banking cartels and corporate supply chains ensure the wealth your farm generates never stays in your local community. It's funneled back up to service the debt.
And the authors position the 30K Club's philosophy as the explicit countermeasure to this trap. True economic liberation isn't achieved by fighting the oppressor system from within its own financial constraints.
You can't beat the house by playing their games with their chips when they own the rulebook.
Exactly. You must bypass their system entirely by providing what they call independent, massive capital.
The idea is that when a community acquires territory, they absolutely must not be forced to beg their historical oppressors for funding.
You bring your own millions to the table. You construct parallel funding mechanisms so that when you claim the 100 acres, you already have the tractors and seeds paid for in cash.
Retaining 100% of the wealth locally?
Now, up until this point, we've been dealing with tangible macroeconomic concepts: land distribution, debt traps, politics, the concrete and steel of the invisible architecture.
But this is where we pivot into the later chapters. The Pod 8 material.
And it introduces a paradigm shift that is genuinely jarring.
We enter the exploration of the spiritual anchor of the soil.
The source material moves entirely away from standard policy and uncovers an unseen architecture that governs the true generation of wealth.
The authors make a very bold assertion. If a leader or corporation attempts to govern acquired land, utilizing only modern business logic, treating the earth strictly as a secular spreadsheet, they guarantee their empire will eventually collapse.
Which is a direct, aggressive challenge to the completely secular, hyper-rationalized, modern understanding of economics.
They argue that trying to govern land without acknowledging its spiritual and moral governance is like trying to fly an airplane while denying the existence of gravity.
I was deeply struck by the historical context here. They point out that throughout human history, across virtually every ancient civilization, land was never viewed merely as a physical asset or a dead commodity.
The text highlights African communities prior to violent colonial extraction. They understood the soil as a living, breathing entity.
They didn't just walk out and drop seeds based on a calendar.
Yeah.
They performed deeply ingrained communal rituals. They aligned the moral purpose of the community with the spirit of the land.
A symbiotic relationship designed to spiritually guarantee the physical harvest. And the authors are careful to frame this not as some isolated folklore, but as a universal divine truth.
Right. They reference the foundational texts of major religions, the Bible, the Quran, the Torah.
In all these traditions, the ultimate blessing from the divine is always, without exception, tied to physical territory.
Every great religious narrative about overflowing economies revolves around securing and righteously governing physical land. Physical land is the tangible manifestation of spiritual authority.
But this forces a massive, uncomfortable question.
Yeah, if this spiritual blueprint has existed for millennia, what happened to it? Why is modern economics violently severed from it?
The authors claim the architects of the modern global economy deliberately hid this ancient blueprint from the masses.
Which leads us to the dual system. As extractive empires expanded, they didn't just steal the earth through military violence, they committed an insidious act of psychological warfare.
They systematically severed the conquered masses' spiritual connection to the earth.
They forced the masses to view sacred ground merely as a sterile commodity, a deadline item on a balance sheet.
But the truly insidious part is how this dual system operates today. The elite monopolies, the dynastic families at the top, still actively understand and utilize these hidden spiritual principles to maintain their dominance.
While intentionally conditioning the general public to rely strictly on secular science, cold logic, and individual debt.
I really want to make sure we understand the mechanics of this because
Yeah.
it sounds esoteric until you look at how elite structures actually operate.
Yeah, what does that look like practically? Literal boardroom seances.
No, it's highly structural. Think about dynastic wealth versus how the middle class manages money. The public is taught hyper-individualism. Go to school, get your personal student loan, get an individual mortgage, save for an isolated retirement.
Right. Science and debt.
Exactly. Fragmented and debt-driven. But examine the highest echelons of wealth. They operate on deeply guarded transgenerational principles. Family offices, multi-generational trusts, highly exclusive networks.
Like secret societies and Ivy League institutions.
These function exactly like ancient communal rituals. They align a singular, focused intent over centuries. They protect their internal ecosystem fiercely, operating on shared moral codes, and view land as a generational legacy.
They are anchored. It's the ultimate gatekeeping. They keep the mechanisms of unified intent for themselves while tossing the masses a textbook on compound interest.
The text argues that if you're out there trying to build an empire using only the fragmented rules of secular banking, you're playing a rigged game with half a rulebook.
And this is where the 30K Club presents its synthesis. They demand a radical return to this ancient blueprint, but merged with modern capital.
Right. They don't want to regress. They want to merge the millions of dollars needed to bypass the banks with ancient spiritual law and absolute moral discipline.
Holding a title deed means nothing if the land isn't activated through this disciplined ritual backing.
Without both physical capital and spiritual anchor, the structure hollows out and collapses.
Now, if we accept this premise that the masses are distracted by science and debt, while elites use a hidden infrastructure, we are forced to ask a very dark question. What is the actual nature of the economic system we wake up in every day?
And that leads into the most chilling sections of Article 36. If it's this deliberately engineered, we're not just experiencing an unfair free market, we're experiencing something actively hostile.
The authors describe it as the brutal, silent warfare of the modern era.
Silent warfare. It completely reframes our daily struggles to pay bills or find housing.
They argue this modern economic oppression is far more effective than historical physical slavery or military dictatorship. Because if an invading force puts an iron chain around your wrist, you know who your enemy is.
You know you're a prisoner, and your instinct is to fight back.
But economic oppression is an entirely invisible cage. It is brilliant in its cruelty because it convinces the prisoner that they are entirely free.
It's like a lifelong subscription model for your own existence.
Yes. You feel free because you can choose which corporate grocery store you walk into or which centralized bank you apply to for a car loan.
You choose which multinational monopoly to submit your resume to.
You feel like a free agent. But all the while, that invisible cage strictly dictates what quality of nutrient-dense food you can actually afford, what narrow neighborhoods you are financially permitted to live in.
And ultimately, based on your healthcare access, it dictates how long you're going to survive.
You never actually own the means of your survival. You're just renting your life from the system.
And what's alarming is how the authors connect this invisible warfare back to the demographic crisis.
The youth bulge.
Right, the 68.6 million young people. The authors issue a severe generational warning. If adults refuse to awaken to this silent warfare today, if we pretend the system is just going through a rough patch, we are consciously preparing an era of unimaginable suffering for the youth.
We are willingly handing millions of young minds over to a system that views them as nothing more than cheap, disposable labor for an extractive corporate machine.
A system that structurally assigns them a financial worth lower than the basic cost of their daily caloric intake.
The future labor is already securitized and traded by the elite before they even enter the workforce. It is intensely dystopian.
But the source material does present a historical countermeasure, a fascinating detail about the wisdom of historical elders.
Which provides necessary context for why this knowledge seems so hidden. The authors argue that the wise elders of the continent saw this devastation approaching decades in advance.
They saw the forced urbanization, the shift away from spiritual roots to a hyper-individualized model. They recognized the dual system being constructed.
They knew the masses were going to be swallowed whole. So the elders made a profound strategic decision. They took the sacred knowledge of true wealth, the blueprints for land activation and economic sovereignty, and they intentionally hid it.
They buried it deep within closed, guarded cultural initiations.
They kept it safe from the corrupt, knowing extractive empires would just weaponize it.
And they waited for what the text calls a generation disciplined enough to wield them again. A generation that had suffered enough under the illusion of science and debt to embrace absolute self-accountability.
The knowledge to break systemic poverty hasn't been permanently lost. It's preserved in the shadows for those who carry the moral discipline to handle true power without becoming oppressors.
Which brings us to the crescendo of this entire deep dive. We've done intense macro-level analysis.
The land pizza, the banking traps, the spiritual anchor, the silent warfare. But all this theory ultimately demands a micro-level, intensely personal response from you, the listener.
The philosophy isn't meant to be academic entertainment. It's designed to force a decision, the ultimate choice.
Because the recurring theme across these later chapters is a brutal condemnation of passivity. The authors identify the single greatest threat to the population, and it's not the corporate monopolies.
It's the population's own passive hope. The text calls it a narcotic.
The paralyzing narcotic of passive hope that a savior is coming. The conditioned belief that if you just wait, or cast the right ballot, or wait for foreign corporate investment, your economic reality will magically change.
The text passionately breaks down this illusion. To do nothing, to simply exist within the cage, is not neutrality.
We comfort ourselves thinking, I'm not the corrupt elite, I'm just living my life paying my mortgage. But in a system of actively engineered silent warfare, silence is complicity. Passivity is a profound spiritual failure.
The text states, every single day, you cast a vote for your future by choosing where you spend your money and where you deploy your mind.
If you spend your life exhausting your brilliance, desperately seeking a better job within the corporate structures extracting wealth from your community, you are willingly offering the oppressor the labor and compliance they need to maintain the cage.
You are, in the vivid words of the text, feeding the beast that bites you.
It's a ruthless assessment. The elite monopolies produce nothing on their own. Their empire is built on the backs of the masses' labor and consumer support.
Therefore, withdrawing that support and building your own parallel structures is the only effective form of rebellion.
And we can see this concept of sovereign economic backing working on a massive macro scale globally. Look at the United Arab Emirates.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
They utilize their vast mineral wealth, their oil, not just as a commodity for quick cash to Western cartels, but as a sovereign anchor.
Right, they used it to build undeniable global leverage.
Creating an entire civilization and economic gravity that dictates its own terms. They anchored their pride and power to their soil.
And you see a different variation of that in China. Over decades, they invested heavily in ensuring their entire country became the indispensable industrial production engine for the world.
They made production their national anchor. In both macro examples, they did not passively await permission from the global order to become powerful. They actively built parallel economic gravity. They acted today.
Which brings us back to the micro, the individual ultimatum from the 30K Club. You cannot wait for the system to suddenly develop a conscience. The text explicitly states that awaiting is, in itself, an act.
It is an act of total surrender.
If you are waiting, you've already lost the war. The mandate is to act today.
To actively begin building a parallel, decentralized economic structure in your own life. And when people see that courage and follow you tomorrow, you become a true leader.
The 30K Club claims to offer the ritual backing and financial artillery to assist, but the message extends beyond their group.
The fundamental principle is you must become an active architect. Stop begging the monopoly to sustain you. Stop asking the cage for a more comfortable perch.
You must take an uncompromising stand on building a new economic civilization.
They demand uncompromising integrity, massive independent capital, and deep spiritual alignment. The choice presented at the end of this material is entirely binary.
Will you consciously choose the arduous path of becoming an architect of a new civilization? Or will you continue to labor under the illusion of freedom, hoping for a salvation that will never come?
Acting as the daily architect of your own poverty.
It's a heavy choice.
So let's take a breath and recap the immense journey we've just been on through these texts. We started by looking at the harsh physical mathematics of the land pizza.
The reality that the vast majority are squeezed onto customary land without title deeds, while a microscopic elite monopolizes the profit-generating slices.
We explored the illusion of the land war, realizing that forcefully taking back the dirt without massive independent capital is an engineered trap.
Forcing the victor back into the hands of the centralized banking cartels as a stressed sharecropper.
Then we plunged into the esoteric later chapters, the deeply provocative idea that the soil requires a spiritual anchor.
That for millennia, land was governed by communal rituals, and that the modern elite secretly maintained a dual system.
Utilizing transgenerational architecture to anchor their wealth while deliberately distracting the masses with the isolating illusion of science and individual debt.
Leading to the chilling realization that modern economics is an invisible, silent war designed to make lifelong dependency feel exactly like freedom.
An intricate cage built to harvest the intelligence and labor of the many to continually enrich the few. And finally, we confronted the ultimate choice.
That passive hope is a dangerous narcotic. Silence is active complicity, and waiting for a savior is an act of generational surrender.
So we want to leave you with a final, lingering question to explore on your own, a thought that builds on everything we've meticulously discussed today. The text argues forcefully that the elite use hidden, unified spiritual principles to govern their empires, while actively teaching you to rely solely on the fragmented mechanics of science and debt.
Right.
Look at your own life right now. Look at your chosen career path, your deepest financial ambitions, the exact way you are trying to build your future. Are you merely chasing the math?
Are you exhausting your one life, playing the game strictly by the rules that were handed to you, by a system explicitly designed to extract your energy?
Or are you actively building your own internal, unshakable infrastructure? Are you cultivating a personal blueprint that ensures you actually own your success instead of letting your success and the system that validates it entirely own you?
Are you the architect holding the blueprint? Or are you just blindly laying the bricks for someone else's skyscraper?
That is the ultimate question to sit with. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly intense deep dive into the hidden architecture of power, land, and silent economics. We hope it sparked something vital in you. Until next time, keep questioning the blueprint.